that for
Thank
us.
you very much, Chair. Yeah, good morning.
Morning.
So just wondering, are you planning to update the taxi action plan? And if so, how are you planning to update it?
So obviously you will be aware that the taxi and private hire action plan was produced, and we are continuing to develop our relationship and our issues around this. It does link in with some of the issues that emerged from the task and finish group that was led by the Department for Transport, where there were a number of recommendations that emerged on cross-border hiring, for example, on national minimum standards for taxi and private hire vehicle licensing, on statutory definition of both applying for hire and pre-booked, on worker rights, on national compliance and enforcing powers, on issuing fixed penalty notices, on regulating pedicabs, very importantly, and capping taxi and private hire vehicle licenses. We were an active member of the Department for Transport group, and the changes were discussed in detail. There aren't, all of these issues have not been addressed in the way that we wanted, but the measures that were set out in the Mayor's Taxi and Private Hire Action Plan in 2016, the link with this were the controls of cross-border hiring, the capping of driver and vehicle licence numbers, the definition of applying for hire and pre-book services, the greater enforcement of the legislation to regulate pedicabs. So at the moment we're in this situation where we're waiting further response from the DFT to the report, and we hope that will result in positive and swift action being taken among those action areas, and that will then allow us to not necessarily redo the taxi and private action plan, but to ensure that it's properly relevant going forward given this other piece of work.
Yeah, many of those things that you mentioned would need some new primary legislation in Westminster to happen. Can you say any more about the sort of discussions you've had with people in the DFT and the APBG and other members of Parliament as to possibly when the primary legislation might occur?
Well, you're quite right to say that, and just to give you some detail around that, on workers' rights, for example, the government has agreed that those rights go beyond taxi and private hire, that may not be in the scope of licensing authorities to determine. However, I'm very mindful that passenger safety is an ultimately very important issue here, and actually we need to ensure that driver hours, particularly with the opportunity sometimes for drivers to work for more than one operator, without necessarily the same controls you would have, for example, from an HGV driver, where you have, your personal tachograph, your data as to how many hours you can drive comes with you. So if you move from one HGV to another, that comes with you. It's about you as an individual, not those sort of controls in place for private hire vehicle drivers. That's something we need to be looking at. On national compliance and enforcement powers, the government has agreed to introduce legislation in that area, and we've had preliminary discussions with the DFT as to where that legislation might be included and how it might be able to be enacted. To enforce fixed penalty notices fairly and proportionally, well, again, we would need additional powers to issue fixed penalty notices to private hire drivers. We're working with the DFT on amending current legislation there. That actually doesn't require primary legislation. That would be a statutory instrument, and we'll continue to push the government for that instrument to be enacted. On regulating pedicabs, I'm delighted to say the government is really supportive of a pedicab regulation, which I think we all remember. Unfortunately, because of this issue with private members' bills, it seems to always happen in Parliament. The private members' bill wasn't progressed, so it doesn't look like there's going to be sufficient time within this parliamentary session. But the government did say if it did get scuppered, the private members' bill, or did get talked out, or whatever the technical term is, that it will put forward its own legislation in this area as well. The government has no plans to take forward the proposal on capping the licence numbers. However, clearly we are exploring the other levers that we put in place, so things like the removal of the exemption for congestion charge from private hire vehicles, as you know, has just happened quite recently. And again, we need to tie that in with the cross-border hiring issue, which again, they didn't start this task and finish group with a view that that was necessary. They now understand, following our inputs, as to why it's an important area as well. So, look, there's lots to do on this, but I think we are inching forward, I would say.
There's something I want to pick up on in terms of safety and also related to cross-border hiring. It's an idea that's come from some of the taxi organisations that I'm and you are in contact with is setting up some kind of national database or register of taxi drivers and private hire vehicle drivers, because you can have someone who's done something wrong here in London without any kind of national register. They can just go and get licensed in Southend or Sheffield and something, and then with cross-border hiring they can continue to work here. Have you had any discussions with the DFT about that in particular? Because I think that's something very important to do.
Well, I can't comment on that specifically. I'm not sure if we have, but again, I can communicate back with you as to whether we have had any detailed discussions. I don't actually know is a simple answer to that. However, I would say in principle it seems very sensible, and I think if it's administratively feasible, which is often the challenge with these sort of things, then that is something that does make sense, of course.
Particularly in terms of safety, because if someone's committed an assault,
which is at the forefront of our thinking, and I know you're a great advocate of that as well. So yeah. Yeah,
thanks. Now, I'm sure you're aware that the Transport Committee has just released a report on the taxi and private hire vehicle trade, and there's a couple of things I'd like you to ask you about in there, which is. We had some discussions with the licensing authority over in New York, and they have another category of sort of operator, which is a high volume operator. What are your thoughts on implementing that and creating a new category for private hire operators, which have a significant number of vehicles and drivers and journeys?
Well, I'm obviously aware of that recommendation, and just to reassure you that our Director of Licensing, Regulation, Charging, Helen Chapman, has regular discussions with many of our partner cities, including, very importantly, with New York, actually, about how they operate their model to fit their city. Now, clearly there's some legislative differences, quite significant legislative differences between different jurisdictions, you'll understand, but that is an area that she has begun some discussion with them, albeit it is only a few weeks since your report, of course, was published. I think at the end of March it was published, wasn't it? So, yeah.
Is that something you could do unilaterally as the licensing authority here, or would that need some new legislation?
I think we would need some legislation at first glance on that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the sort of statutory definitions? You mentioned that earlier with pre-booked and apply for hire, because that does seem to create some confusion, and now with the introduction of apps which have sort of come in after those statutory definitions were sort of put in place. Now that's blurring the boundaries. I mean, what are your thoughts on those? Are those definitions good enough, or do they need to be updated? Do they need to be more clearly defined?
Well, we've been consistently saying they need to be more clearly defined, and unfortunately this is one area that the Task and Finish group, the government response was that disagrees as to provide greater clarity and no plans to progress from their perspective. I think that's disappointing, if I'm honest. I think this does require greater clarity. Actually, there was a legal case quite recently that did identify some clearer definition on this, which we're just exploring as to whether that is applicable and how we might use that as a kind of, instead of any legislative guidance, a sort of precedent from a legal perspective, given a decision made in another jurisdiction outside London.
Is that something you could do, to bring a case before a judge so that they could actually give a legal definition?
It's probably not for us to bring the case forward, but certainly that's why we're exploring where there was a case brought forward, whether there's something we could apply on the back of that, if you like.
Okay. Where was that case again?
I think it was Reading, from memory. I want to say Reading. It could have been, it's either Reading or Oxford. Forgive me, Chair, I can't quite remember. But it's...
Okay. Yeah. Right, thank you. Yeah. I mean, another thing in the report that the Transport Committee just did was sort of talking about a charter mark to increase standards in the industry. What are your thoughts on developing proposals for a charter mark?
Well, look, I think, again, I would love to be able to apply all sorts of conditions. Our regulatory framework just doesn't allow us to do that yet. We're the licensing and regulatory authority, but imposing working conditions on PHV drivers isn't part of our regulatory remit as it stands. However, we are working with teams more broadly across City Hall to explore what alternative measures could be introduced to improve driver welfare, which I do think is a really important part of this. I mean, I am really mindful that there are, these are, private hire drivers are an incredibly potentially vulnerable group of employees, general group of people working in London, who I think should have proper rights applied to them. I think that's just a good moral thing for us all to support, as well as, of course, recognising the safety issues, as you rightly identified before. So we don't have the powers at the moment, but it is something that we continue to have discussions on more broadly across City Hall.
Yeah. Now, you introduced the congestion charge for private hire vehicles. Do you have any plans to reassess that? And if so, have you made any assessments of the impact of the congestion charge, or possibly removing the congestion charge from private hire vehicles?
Well, it's obviously very early days, but we will be monitoring the effect of the removal of this exemption for PHV drivers, both on traffic and unique vehicle entries into the zone, which is an important additional piece of information. And indeed, as part of our wider monitoring programme, including the monitoring of the ultra-low emission zone, we'll be analysing how traffic around the boundary of the zone also behaves. So I think that is an area of concern, and of course it will become an even greater concern as we move forward to the ultra-low emission zone extension in a couple of years. So we'll continue to have regular engagement with taxi and private hire teams. I've met with both the private hire industry and the taxi trade in the last couple of weeks since the start of April, and I'll continue to have regular discussions with them.
Okay. Now, another thing that is of great concern to people in the industry is the lack of rapid charging points. I know you're putting more in, but can you tell us how many rapid charging points there are at the moment, and when are there going to be enough for the trade?
Well, so we're on target to install 300 rapid charging points by the end of 2020. We've currently 176 in place, of which 71 are dedicated to taxis. And we're working with other highways authorities and the taxi trade to deliver additional ranks at all 30 Crossrail stations. So far, we've secured locations for taxi ranks at all but 12 of those. That's across the whole network, and we'll continue to work with the highways authorities, offering financial assistance where we can to deliver these. Look, and I recognise the taxi trade has raised some concerns over the planned location of some of the Crossrail taxi ranks, and we'll continue to work with the trade on the specific details of those on a station by station basis. You'll also be aware, of course, that we have the Mayor has written, and I have also written to London boroughs to ensure that they do their utmost to provide rapid charging point facilities on their own roads, and we've had some progress from some boroughs on that, and there's more work still to be done, I have no doubt.
Well, some boroughs have a lot, some boroughs don't have any. I understand that City of Westminster doesn't have any. Which is the place where taxi drivers operate more than any other borough. So what are you going to do about that?
Well, we'll continue to follow up. I mean, as I said earlier on in answer to another question, I have regular meetings with all the boroughs across London on this subject, and I'll continue to push them, every borough, to engage with us on putting rapid charging points where they can on their roads, where we can't do it in ours.
Now, in the meantime, you've got this situation where taxi drivers, if they want to buy a new taxi, have to buy a zero-emission capable taxi. But private hire drivers, if they want to buy a new private hire vehicle, they're still allowed to purchase a Euro 6 diesel engine. And as I understand, that's going to continue for another 3.5 years. Don't you think it's time to reassess that and let taxi drivers be able to purchase Euro 6 diesel engines again, because private hire vehicle drivers are allowed to continue to purchase Euro 6 diesel vehicles?
Well, I think as everyone will know, and the Mayor's been very clear about this, and I fully support him, that London's air quality is an issue of public health, and London's filthy air is a real challenge for our city and for this generation and generations to come, and young people in particular, in terms of the health of their lungs and their breathing capacity as a result of the air quality in London. So we'll continue to do what we think is the right thing to make the greatest contribution to improving air quality in London. I think the balance we've got at the moment is about right. Now, of course, we keep it under review. You can only begin to imagine the submissions made to me at both those meetings of private hire vehicle representative bodies and the taxi trade representative organisations, and both of them made quite different submissions to me. And so on the balance of where we are, I think we've got it about right. But we have to continue to keep it under review. I
would actually disagree with you on the basis of numbers, because the number of new taxis that are bought every year is approximately 1,400. So the number of new private hire vehicles brought every year is approaching 10,000. Yeah. So if you're really serious about reducing air quality, why did you not go for the part of the trade which has the bigger number? Surely you would improve air quality far more if you required private hire vehicles to purchase only zero emission capable vehicles. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, I think that's why that we made the decisions we made around following consultation around private hire vehicles and the removal of the exemption for congestion charging. So that's another very clear indication. Incidentally, for the ultra-low emission zone, we're seeing broadly about 70% compliance in the early figures that I've just had access to this morning of vehicles entering the ultra-low emission zone. So I think we've got to see how these things play out. It's always easy, and I know you're not advocating this, by the way, for the avoidance of doubt. It's always easy to knee-jerk into particular interventions that can have unintended consequences. I think we've got the balance about right at the moment. I listen very, very clearly to individual views and concerns. So I've had some interesting views expressed just recently from one of the taxi trade representatives, which we're exploring actively and positively, and we'll continue to work with them when constructive ideas are put before us.
Well, I mean, you brought forward the implementation of the ULEZ by a year. Are you going to bring forward the implementation of private hire vehicles having to purchase zero emission capable only vehicles?
Well, there's no plans to do that at the moment. We brought through the ultra-low emission zone by a year because the urgency to tackle London's toxic air is self-evident to anyone.
But you don't feel that it's urgent enough to prevent private hire?
I think, as I say, we continue to keep under review all our policy interventions. There will be things that over time we may need to amend and change, and I think it's important that we keep all these under review and properly assessed over time.
Okay. Well, one final question, which is also of great concern to the trade, is the lack of access, or the restriction of access to taxi vehicles, which are all wheelchair accessible, into some areas which they are allowed to go before, but their access is being restricted, particularly roads like Tooley Street, Tottenham Court Road, and so on. This is of great concern to taxi drivers and also the users of taxis who use them because they need to, because they have a physical impairment or they use a wheelchair and will no longer be able to have easy access to some of these roads. Yeah. Don't you think you need to reconsider some of these restrictions on taxi drivers and make sure that they are still able to use Tooley Street, Tottenham Court Road and other areas?
Well, yes, where appropriate is the simple answer to that, and that's why the consultations that we've had recently, for example, on Tooley Street, is a genuine consultation where we will be clearly reviewing those issues, and there will no doubt have been many of such submissions made in result of Tooley Street. But we do have to do this on the balance of how we also create, just given the discussion earlier on from Assemblymember Russell around how this feels for pedestrians and cyclists as well. So it's always a balance. When you have a constrained road space in a city that was constructed the way that London is, as you well know, this is always a careful balance, but I can assure you that the consultation, for example, into Tooley Street was a genuine one, and we will be issuing the outcome of that very shortly.
When will the results of
very shortly, within the next month or so.
Okay, right, thank you.
Yeah.
Right.